welcome everybody to the Royal Entomological Society's monthly evening online talk. My name's Richard Harrington. I'm chair of the meetings committee and I'm an RES trustee. So great to see you. We've got an amazing speaker this evening and I'll introduce Bob Pyle in just a moment. You may have noticed that the speaker was switched with next month's because unfortunately Angharad Gatehouse is unable to present this evening due to unforeseen circumstances. Bob very kindly agreed to bring his talk forward by a month, which is amazing, and Angharad will talk on the 7th of June. So I've just got a couple of housekeeping notes and a couple of RES updates before I hand over to Bob. First of all, could you please keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off throughout, because this conserves the bandwidth and it minimises disruption to our speaker. There will be plenty of time at the end for questions, and there are two ways you can do that. Either submit your questions via chat, or with a rather small number of people that we've got this evening, we think it would be perfectly manageable for you to ask your questions in person. And indeed, I think that Bob and indeed myself would prefer that. So if you would rather ask in person than commit your questions to chat, then that option will be open. So just a few society highlights over the next couple of months. The real big one is coming up 23rd to 27th of May, when the Society has a garden in the main avenue at the Chelsea Flower Show in London. That garden is funded to a very major extent by a project Giving Back, and the garden is designed by the famous Tom Massey, who's appeared on television on a number of occasions and has won gold at Chelsea before. And this is a unique opportunity to bring entomology to a new audience and to really highlight the work that the RES is doing and its objectives. Then on the 31st of May, there is the first meeting of a brand new special interest group, the Insect Welfare and Ethics Special Interest Group. That is both online and in person at Writtle University College at Chelmsford in Essex. So that's going to be a very interesting first meeting in what it might be quite a controversial subject area. So if that is something that interests you, please go online and register for that meeting. Then, as I said, on the 7th of June, we have the evening meeting with Angharad Gatehouse, which will major on invertebrate molecular biology. And then on the 17th of June, we have a conservation special interest group meeting joint with the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. And that's being held at our reserve that we run jointly with the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust at Daneway Banks in Gloucestershire. But do please note that the numbers are going to be very limited for that meeting because of the sensitivity of the SSSI site, especially right in the middle of large blue flight season as it is. So if you would like to come to that, there are 3 talks in the morning in nearby Village Hall, and then a trip to Daneway in the afternoon, and we hope the weather will be suitable for seeing large blues, but please register for that very soon because places will go quickly. So that's the next couple of months, and then the only other advanced warning that I want to give relates to our major meeting of the year, ENTO 23. Early bird registration for that is open and remains open until the 29th of May. The meeting itself is the 5th to the 7th of September at the Cornwall campus of the University of Exeter. Invited speakers and session themes are already agreed. They're on the website. It's going to be a fantastic conference in a very beautiful part of the UK. So for more information on that and to register, please visit the events page of our website. So that's all the announcements, and it's now my very great privilege and pleasure to introduce one of our honorary fellows and winner of our 2022 award for insect conservation, Dr. Bob Pyle. Now, Bob, many of you know, pioneered and popularized insect conservation and has been doing so since the 1970s, battling, I would say, very successfully against what Simon Lever termed institutional vertebratism. And it really all began with a Fulbright scholarship year, working with John Heath at Monk's Wood, the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology, as was the good old days. And there he contributed to pioneering methods for monitoring, understanding, and observing insects. And this inspired him to back home to found the Xerces Society in 1971, the first conservation organization in the Americas devoted entirely to insects. And that still flourishes, and it's a major driver of policy and practice, very influential. Bob was also part of the group that instituted the 4th of July butterfly counts in the States, which remain a hugely popular vehicle for citizen science. And in 1976, with Lincoln Brower, he initiated efforts to save the threatened monarch, the migratory monarch butterfly. He's also well known and established butterfly conservation efforts in Papua New Guinea and in Australia. He helped to compile the first IUCN Invertebrate Red Data book, and he's inspired people around the world, including children, with lectures and with his many books, some of which, or many of which, actually range beyond entomology. You know, it's more than fair to say that he's a renowned poet and author and winner of various literary prizes, including a Guggenheim Fellowship. So, with that, I hand over to Bob, and invite him to present his talk called From Monk's Wood to Hollywood, 50 years in insect conservation. Over to you, Bob, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that fulsome introduction. That was elegant and very kind and far more than I deserve. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight, which is a cliche, but it's one, you know, cliches get that way for a reason. I mean it. It's a huge pleasure and honor. The last time I spoke to the Royal Entomological Society was 43 years ago on a Wednesday evening in Queensgate in London, in the old evening meetings. And I can't remember if I spoke that time on Papua New Guinea and the bird-winged butterflies, or on the monarchs of Mexico, the migratory monarchs of North America, or perhaps the Invertebrate Red Data book that Sue Wells and Mark Collins and I were compiling at the time in Cambridge. But that was the last time, 43 years ago. So here we are again. At least you can't be faulted, Richard, for inviting speakers too frequently, the same ones. 43 years is a good gap. I have to give a couple of disclaimers on my talk tonight. First of all, the title implies that I'm speaking about insect conservation. And that is true, but as you might have suspected, most of the attention goes to the Lepidoptera as always. I'm putting my camera down a little so you can see my brimstone for spring. And among the Lepidoptera, most of it goes to butterflies. So it's one more talk on butterfly conservation primarily, but I hope you'll find that much of what I have to say applies to the order in general. Second disclaimer, I apologize for my voice. I went to England a year ago and Cambridge mostly, and came back with COVID and ended up with long COVID, which is something you don't want to get. It's made a tougher year than it would have been otherwise, and it has affected my voice. So my my booming baritone is diminished. I hope you can understand me adequately. And as for the Hollywood part, you'll see when we get there. All right, with those disclaimers, I'm going to share my screen and begin my talk. And Richard, again, thank you for the very, very kind introduction and for having me here tonight, which is a greater honor than I can possibly express, as is the 2022 Conservation Award. It means more to me than I can tell you, more than almost anything. Thank you. Have we all got that? Got my screen?
Yeah, all good, Bob, all good.
Okay, good. There we are. Now I'm actually going back not just 50 years, but I am going to begin almost 70 years ago with a little band of Cub Scouts on the rural outskirts of Denver, Colorado. I am the healthy specimen on the right. And this skinny one over here was my neighbor across the street who became my butterfly collecting buddy through all my early years. And we joined the Cub Scouts in the vain hope that it would have something to do with nature study, which it did not. And so we quickly got out and formed our own little band of two. We called ourselves the Magpie Scouts, and we haunted the banks of an old canal, not a canal in the British navigational sense, but an irrigation canal called the Highline Canal that took the water from the snowmelt in the Rockies through a tunnel and a canyon and then out through the canal, winding out onto the prairie east of Denver, where it irrigated the early parched farms in Colorado settlement. And it also nourished all the kids who played along the banks of the canal, although we were forbidden by the water company from doing so, and certainly from swimming or tubing in the canal. And the ditch rider threw us out all the time. But of course, we were right back again. The Highline Canal meant everything to me. It was my birthplace as a naturalist, and it's where I learned my butterflies. I found ultimately 10% of the North American butterfly fauna along the banks of this 90-mile ditch between the mountains and the plains in Colorado. Today, that canal is a very valued green space and urban greenway in Denver that many, many, many thousands of people ride, walk, bicycle, run, and hike along with a big trail. It's a very, very different place from what I knew when the public wasn't even allowed there, but of course we did use it. Some of the big cottonwood trees are still there, one of which saved my life, a big hollow one in a hailstorm in 1954, quite literally saved my life. 12 cattle were killed in the field next to me, but my brother and I were hiding in the hollow cottonwood. So as I say, that canal meant absolutely everything to me. However, over the years, I watched its habitats diminish as they were destroyed for development, homes, schools, shopping centers, parking lots, and so on and so forth. And I started my first conservation efforts in about 1965 when I graduated from high school, trying to convince the city council of Aurora, Colorado, to set aside some of the remaining habitat. Now, all these years later, the Highline Canal Conservancy, which I started in 1967, is finally doing the job and saving every last bit they possibly can. It's a little bit late, much has been lost. And this is where I witnessed my very first extinctions that made me the conservationist that I am and that I became. I was able to discover for myself lots of little colonies of uncommon butterflies left over from the early pioneer days in the fields and meadows around Aurora, Colorado, all of which are subdivisions now for 20 miles out onto the plains. Those habitats are virtually all gone. But one of my favorites was the Olympia marble wing, related to your orange tip. We have orange tips too, but this is essentially an orange tip without orange tips. And this subspecies, Euchloe Olympia rosa, was so named Rosa for the pink flesh on the wings. I loved that butterfly. I was thrilled with it every year when it appeared. And then one year it no longer appeared because the habitat for it was converted to a playing field for my new school. And I ended up throwing the discus on the very field where I had previously chased Olympia marble-winged butterflies. That was my first extinction, along with a colony of bronze coppers that disappeared when a church paved its marshy parking lot. And I wrote in my book, The Thunder Tree, I became a non-believer and a conservationist in one fell swoop, the day the Lutherans paved their parking lot. But the Olympia marble-wing made me a conservationist. And over the next number of years, I began writing my first essays and papers addressed to lepidopterists and how they needed to take responsibility for the resource that they exploited for their pleasure and for their science and their enjoyment, the butterflies and the other insects, which led over a few years to my, in postgraduate studies at the University of Washington, getting the Fulbright Fellowship that Richard referred to, and going to Monkswood Experimental Station in Abbotsford near Huntingdon, in the county that was at that time Huntingdonshire, now part of Cambridgeshire. The director at the time was Kenneth Mellanby, who also happened to be the chairman of the Joint Committee for the Conservation of British Insects. So that was appropriate. He approved my coming, and so did my mentor at Monkswood, John Heath. Here's Kenneth Mellanby, King Mole, they called him. He studied moles, and he is consulting his crystal ball, I guess, which if he looked far enough into the future, he would have seen the demise of Monkswood under the Thatcher administration and its ultimate extinction. But that's a sad later story. For many years, however, Monkswood thrived as a great seat of science and a great seat of applied conservation biology. John Heath, shown here with his magnificent monumental eyebrows and crepuscular or cranial crest, I'm trying to say. John Heath was the person who started the British Butterfly Recording Scheme, which became a model for the butterfly recording schemes all over the world. Here he is with the top technology of the time, recording the dots on the maps that became the first atlases of British butterflies. But he directed that program and later became the director of the entire Biological Record Center, run by Frank Paring, the botanist, when I was there. John became the director a little bit later. But John was my first great mentor, and I owe everything to him and my year at Monkswood among the many colleagues. Of course, there were many pubs involved, and I thought it was a wonderfully civilized activity to take the pub lunch from work. We didn't do it every day by any means, but especially on birthdays, we'd go over to the perfect postcard village of Wennington, to the Royal Oak, and have a pint and a Plowman's. I can still taste the Boston pickle. By the way, this is myself. It was said by John Heath and others that the first time Professor Mellanby met me in the hallway at Monkswood, he looked me in the face and said, "Good God, Jesus Christ," turned around and went back to his office. I don't know if that's true. I think I remember that. But here's John, here's Frank Paring, and some of our staff at Monkswood at the time, with some of the questionable style choices. Never mind all that. It's all relative, and who cares? Now, not many here today perhaps will recognize all of these names. I'm not going to read them, you can read, but these were some of the members of the staff, most of the ones I most interacted with at Monkswood at the time. I call them all my tutors. And they ranged from the director to the manager of the adjacent National Nature Reserve, Monkswood National Nature Reserve. But I'm sure that a number of you will recognize some of these names. Your former president and Professor Jeremy Thomas, Shirley, Norman Moore. There are other very well-known biologists here, but they were all there together at that time. And it was my extraordinary good luck to be able to study with all of them for that enchanted year. John made sure that I had many encounters outside of Monkswood as well, all over the United Kingdom, with entomologists, conservationists, and others. These are just a few of them with whom I had the pleasure of spending time and by whom I was deeply influenced during that remarkable year. Professor Tim Sparks, formerly of Cambridge, also formerly of Monkswood, said this about Monkswood at the time and for the years following. It is unlikely that such a vibrant mix of gifted staff will ever exist again. For those of us who worked there, it was a privilege. It was all of that and more for me. It was everything that followed in my life. And what a lucky boy I was to be there. One of these, I'm going to mention just a couple of the people there and what they were doing. One of them here messing about with snails in this picture, though that was not his ultimate primary source, is a face and a name you should know. It's Ernest Pollard, who is the founder of the butterfly monitoring method, which has come to be known around the world as the Pollard walks. And there is probably no more ubiquitous tool for monitoring butterflies, and I dare say other orders as well, than the Pollard walks. They are endorsed, employed, carried out by citizen scientists and institutional scientists all over the world. Ernie probably comes the closest of any of the people from Monkswood to being a household name, at least among lepidopterists and conservationists, although not very many know that they're really the Ernie Pollard walks, not just the Pollard walks. And the animal that probably kicked off butterfly conservation, insect conservation in the UK was the large copper, Lycaena dispar, which wasn't this big, but it was much bigger than most coppers and absolutely brilliant, and was extirpated through the drainage of the fens for tulips and carrots and other things, coming to a head in the 1860s. Some said and wrote that it was put away by over collecting. Well, it might have been the coup de grace, but certainly not. It was the diminishment and ultimately the destruction of almost all of the native fen habitats. Well, that started the insect conservation movement with a committee to try to save the last of it that was conducted by Lord Walter Rothschild, beginning in the 1860s, which led to the Joint Committee for the Conservation of British Insects, and ultimately to the conservation of Wood-Walton fen, which is very near Monkswood. But it's the one of the last of the remnants of the old Finland. It's maintained now by a clay berm that keeps the water in. But you see how much the Finland in general has shrunken through desiccation over the hundreds of years that they've been drained and worked, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Wood-Walton is maintained through intensive management, but the copper itself became an utter homozygote and practically a clone, and was maintained only by the most artificial of means. But the research on the copper, which was later, after its extinction, reintroduced from Germany and then from Holland, was conducted by Eric Duffy, who was one of the great scientists at Monkswood at the time. And it taught us a lot about what to do at the next extinction, the next reintroduction. One of the non-Monkswood people with whom I had the great pleasure to spend time, a lot more time later on, when she became an honorary consultant for the Xerces Society, was Miriam Rothschild, the grandniece of Lord Walter Rothschild. And she carried on conservation of Wood-Walton, but also of the habitats in and around Oundle, where her home was, including some of the very last populations of the checkered skipper in England, where it subsequently became extinct, still survives in Scotland and may come back to England. In fact, I think the first reintroductions may have been successfully performed. Again, many pubs were involved, and one of my favorites surely had to be the pub in Miriam's village of Oundle, not Oundle, but the village of Ashton Wold, outside of Oundle. Miriam's pub was called the Checkered Skipper. Perhaps it's still there, I don't know. But it may be the only pub, and I wrote about this one time in Antenna, with, it's not the only pub with insects on the pub sign by a long shot, but it's maybe the only one with the dorsal depiction of an endangered butterfly picked out in copper and brass nails on one side and the ventral surface on the other side. Had good beer too. It's called Skipper Ale. And one last person I'll mention in Monkswood, one of the last staff scientists, was Jack Dempster, a name very well known in ecological and population biology circles. He worked on cabbage whites at Rothamsted and later on Tyria jacobii, the cinnabar moth, and its population dynamics with Senecio jacobii, the tansy ragwort. Both of those organisms have been imported to where I live in Washington State. The tansy was not welcome. The cinnabar has been wonderfully welcome here. But through his work on the cinnabar moth, his development of its life tables and a recipe for how to understand the autoecology of an organism to sustain it on site, Jack was able to apply the same methods to the effort to conserve the swallowtail in Britain, which was also lost almost entirely to the drainage of the fens. Jack's efforts were aimed at Wicken Fen, where Darwin collected the swallowtail when he skipped out of class at Cambridge, as he often did, to go beetle collecting, primarily at Wicken and elsewhere. Became extinct at Wicken during successional changes during the war, when the reeds were no longer harvested for thatch. And later, the efforts to put it back at Wicken were powered by Jack's research. They did not, in fact, succeed, probably due to genetic reasons and also management mistakes. But it has succeeded to be to survive so far in Norfolk, and more about that in a moment when I get to the Red Data book. So those are some of the projects that were going on at Monkswood when I was there. Here we are in the wilds of Norfolk, and where reeds are still harvested and habitat maintains. But those same methods of Jack Dempster's were being put into action by a young postgraduate student at Monkswood when I was there. So we were graduate students at Monkswood together. And this is none other than Professor Jeremy Thomas, your former president and a luminary of this society. And you'll know Jeremy from the Large Blue and from much else. Later, the Hope Professor of Ecology at Oxford, OBE, etc. But Jeremy was a graduate student at Monkswood at the time, and he is here working on the habitat and the immature stages of the black and brown hair streaks, which were his PhD research topic. Jeremy didn't spend all of his time on step ladders in Monkswood looking for the larvae and eggs of hair streaks. He also liked to have fun. We were kids. We were graduate students. We went to the pub and we had fun. And Jeremy was quite an artist too. And this is his depiction of moi for a talk I was giving in Godmanchester to mostly Monkswood people in 1971. And if that picture looks a little bit far-fetched from what you see before you, you can take a look at this one from a few years later, like 30 years later or so, with me in conference with Jonathan Pelham, my coast colleague here in Washington State, 50 years a Teamster and truck driver, lorry driver, labor activist, but the most knowledgeable lepidopterist and autodidactic biologist in my entire acquaintance, the world-respected author of the catalog of North American butterflies, Jonathan Pelham. We're in conference here over some arcane butterfly matter, and I think you can see here now that that Jeremy's depiction was perhaps not so very far off. Jeremy was working on the black hair streak and the brown hair streak because they had been progressively dropping out of the oak ash habitats that form more or less an archipelago on the uplands, handily running between Oxford and Cambridge. And no one knew exactly why. Jeremy was able to discover why, and the different management changes and neglect and so on that had brought about changes in both the blackthorn hosts and the oak trees that were important as behavioral postings for the butterflies. And it was his prescriptions he was able to draw from his doctoral research that resulted not only in the survival of these hair streaks at Monk's Wood, but the re-inhabiting, the rewilding, the re-inhabiting of many of those oak ash woodlands with both the black and the brown hair streak. And this is a beautiful thing that happened at Monk's Wood, was the integration of applied and basic research. While I was there, I was able to attend a lecture by Sir Vincent Wigglesworth, the great insect physiologist at Cambridge, held by candlelight, which was because of the rolling blackouts from the coal strikes that year. And that gave it a metaphysical twinge. But Wigglesworth was talking about basic science and applied science, and how they're not really a dualism, as they're commonly thought, and how there's a kind of a mystical coming together that can happen, that can be magic. And that's what happened at Monk's Wood until a government report brought about reorganization of the Nature Conservancy Council and the Institute for Terrestrial Ecology, and the disintegration of the management and the research functions. And it never worked as well after that. But Jeremy's application of his research, his fine basic science, to the conservation of this butterfly really reached, I think, the apex of butterfly conservation work being done at that time, and has inspired the world of conservationists ever since. Up to the day we're in now, where many, many volunteers go out for butterfly conservation chapters and count hair streak eggs and take part in work parties to manage the blackthorn and the other plants for the hair streaks. What a grand and wonderful conservation success over 50 years. And this photograph is actually in honor of the woman it depicts, who was a sandwich student at Monk's Wood. At the same time, Jeremy and I were there, a botanist working largely with Lena Ward and Terry Wells, Sally Hughes. Sally went on to be the founder of the 4th of July butterfly counts for the Xerces Society at Yale years later. And then later on a senior lecturer at in Botswana, and then most recently at Oxford Brookes University. And very sadly, and here she is near her home in Oxford, counting brown hair streak eggs, thanks to Jeremy's research, our old friend at Monk's Wood all those years before. Very, very sadly, Sally died just weeks ago from a brain tumor, and I would like to dedicate this this talk to her. John Heath asked me to write up my Honest Mirabilis at Monkswood for the entomological record and Journal of Variation. And I never got that done during John's life. John's another who died way too young. But his son, Nigel, still with us in Norfolk, in Northamptonshire, told me, Bob, it's never too late. So I finally wrote that memora, what would you say? Reminiscence, really, of my time at Monkswood, and published it in the entomological record just a couple of years ago, and you can find it there if you want. This is my very last walk with John in Monkswood, much later in the 1980s. But I also wrote up much of the science that was going on at Monkswood, along with a number of those scientists themselves, for an issue of Attila, the journal of the Xerces Society. Sally Hughes did the wonderful covers, in this case, the large copper, that we call the British issue of Attila. Contains, as authors, many of those folks from Monkswood. But you might notice, some of you might recognize in the scene, a stylized version of the fens, and looming up from the fens, the Isle of Ely, looking as it might have done to a wild marshman of the 12th century, as Ely Cathedral rose from its slightly elevated center, the only island in the fens. And now we're going to go right into Ely Cathedral, where about 5 years ago, a memoriam was held for Norman Moore, one of the greatest scientists and public policy people at Monkswood, great dragonfly and damselfly authority, and truly the engine of conservation and agriculture cooperation in the UK. But Norman died, and a memorial was held for him at Ely Cathedral. And this is a little gathering of Monkswood people who were still around all those years later in the Lady Chapel of Ely Cathedral, just about 5 years ago. And among them are Michael Way, who was the great scholar of wayside verges, well-named Michael Way. Forgot to mention that Max Super was there, the great exponent of hedgerow biology. Here's Ernie Pollard himself. Mike Morris, who was my other great mentor at Monkswood, along with John Heath, was Mike Morris, still with us in Dorchester. Mike Morris was one of the great scientists of all insect conservation ever. And Eric Duffy of the large copper and the fens right here in his 90s already, as well as Lena Ward, with whom Sally Hughes studied. So I don't know if any of these folks are with us today, but this meeting's being recorded, and we're going to make darn sure that the ones left are going to see a replay of it. Now I'm going to head back to the large blue for a moment and Jeremy Thomas, because of course you know that Jeremy's work led not only to the conservation of those hair streaks, but after that he was anointed, or perhaps you could say saddled, with the most difficult task of all, the conservation of the large blue. People had been trying to conserve it for 50 years and failing, and it was dropping out of habitat after habitat, and nobody quite knew why, though they had their suspicions. So they gave it to Jeremy, and he applied his same sophisticated tools of auticology and management to learn its truly Byzantine symbiosis with ants, and to bring about the remanagement of the habitats, the rewilding of the Cornish coast, the site where you're going to have your field meeting, and many others today, to where the butterfly thrives. But you must remember that before that, it did become extinct in Britain. And that was noted around the world. Here, for example, in a journal in the United States, a memorial issue, the wide open spaces are closing in quickly from the weight of the whole human race, Waylon Jennings. wasn't it true? However, because we now had the tools in Professor Thomas's toolbox and all the others who worked on it, the habitat came back into shape. The large blue came back from Sweden and is now thriving on its way toward becoming the new English large blue. And that makes a very short story of an incredibly long and complicated story, and it doesn't do it a bit of justice. However, I had to come back to the large blue because that led directly to conservation of Lepidoptera in the United States. Let's go back to it for one more moment, because it was a meeting of not this society, but I think the British Entomological Society in 1971 on December 9th that I attended, where the program was given by Graham Howarth of the British Museum, Natural History. And he was talking about the large blue and what was known about it at that time. This is before Jeremy got his hands on it. And he was anticipating its extinction, which occurred only 8 years later. And Professor Howarth said, and I'll never forget this, if we lose the large blue, we must make it a symbol so that no more British butterflies are lost. Now, at the time had been on this massive high at Monkswood from everything I was learning, but I was also kind of depressed because I didn't know what I was going to do with it. We had no tools, we had no mechanism, we had no organization in the US or elsewhere to try to do the things I was doing. So I was coming out with a wonderful apprenticeship and absolutely no place to practice it. But on the way back to Huntingdon on the train that night from King's Cross, it occurred to me, wait, what did Professor Howard say? Make it a symbol so we lose no more? We've already had our loss. In America, it occurred to me, we lost the Xerces blue. Here we have the male on the left, female on the right. Dorsal ventral of this remarkable blue that was endemic to the San Francisco Peninsula, but became extinct from its development. Became extinct. Scientists were writing about it as early as 1875, same time Walter Rothschild was active with the large copper on Wickenfen. Herman Baer wrote a letter to Herman Strecker, and he said, between Irish hogs and Italian chickens, San Francisco has become fit place for no insect but louse or flea, and we are losing the Xerces blue from its accustomed sand dune habitats. That was in 1875, and the butterfly became extinct in 1943. Well, that night, December 9th, 1971, on the train back from King's Cross to Huntingdon, the Xerces Society came into being. At that time, in the US, there was a fair amount of talk going on, which really began in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and then picked up in 1967 when I and a number of others put out a storm of warnings and invectives, but no real action plan. And then the very first, but there were almost no actions taken for butterfly conservation yet. But in the late 60s, the Nature Conservancy, a private group in the US, acquired, kind of like a county naturalist trust preserve, this little bog in eastern Washington, arid sagebrush desert country, but a perched post-Pleistocene relictual bog, which held a colony, one of very few in Washington, of what we call the silver-bordered bog fritillary, or fritillary. I believe you call it the small pearl-bordered fritillary, Boloria selene. And that was really the first butterfly preserve in North America, to my knowledge. That's where we were starting from. But there were many, many big problems in North America. And with a quick look at a couple of other fritillaries, I'll show you what some of them were that we were facing as the Xerces Society got going in the 1970s. This is the Oregon silver spot, the first butterfly to become federally listed as an endangered species after the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1974. first one in the Northwest. It was facing development and succession of plants on its very few Oregon coastline salt spray meadow habitats. They're all going to brush after the Indian burning stopped, or they're going to condominiums, golf courses, apartments, and so on. That's why the butterfly was listed in one of the Xerces' first projects. It's doing better now, but it's not safe. The most spectacular fritillary in the West is the Nokomis fritillary of the arid deserts of the American Southwest. Those habitats were all endangered by overgrazing and already by desiccation and warming, and of course, very much by global warming now. However, there were a few habitats that could be saved, and Xerces got to work, a number of other people, and we began to see change because not only did we get some habitat protected, but whereas nobody talked about butterfly conservation or insect conservation in 1971, almost no one, by this time in the 80s, look at all the organizations that want to be on board with this project. Or the biggest silver spot or fritillary in North America, the regal fritillary, Spirea idalia, endemic to the tall grass prairie of the Midwest, nectaring here, a mating pair on echinacea. Those tall grass prairies, there are fewer than 1% of them left, of course, after the cow and the plow hit and the Native Americans were eradicated, along with the American bison, and soybeans and corn pretty much rule the day today for most of it. But the bits of tall grass prairie that are left have mostly been protected now, and the regal fritillary survives. However, its host plant, the bird's foot violet, has been victim to overzealous controlled burning for conservation by what we affectionately call the pyrobotanists. The pyrobotanists are burning vast tracts of the remaining prairie lands in favor of reducing biomass and increasing the forbs and native grasses. And that's fine, except they do too much, too fast, too hot. And they have become themselves the greatest danger to the regal fritillary and to a great many rare skippers. And finally, the strangest of our silver spots, a highly sexually dimorphic species called the Diana, the male on the left, the female on the right, which is a blue fritillary, as part of a mimicry ring based around a unpalatable blue swallowtail, the pipevine swallowtail, that Mark Collins will know as a member of the birdwing swallowtail subfamily of the swallowtails. And these butterflies are contending with no less than the removal of their entire habitat through what's called mountaintop removal in the coal country of the Appalachians. This still goes on in certain states that right now are banning books right and left and banning entire classes of people as we speak. The same states are still mining coal in this day and age. And as they do so, they are destroying the habitat of the Diana fritillary. This is a very wonderful and very stupid country in which I live, and those are the kinds of things that we're contending with. However, I have to say it hasn't been all bad, and in the 50-year ride of the Xerces Society, we've had many successes, including bringing back this butterfly and its host plant, both federally listed endangered species, the Fender's blue of the Willamette Valley of Oregon and the Kincaid's lupin, both of them narrow endemics, thought to be extinct, both rediscovered on small preserves, and through 30 years of research by Professor Cheryl Schultz of the Washington State University and her many, many students, we now have lots of reserves being managed for them, and they have made a spectacular comeback. So I can say that in the 50 years it's been around, 50, going on 52 years, I hope we've made a difference. with the Xerces Society. Our longtime executive director, Scott Black, should be sainted someday. It's a little too soon now, but he's been a wonderful director, and Xerces thrives. Started that December 9th of 1971 on the train, just a volunteer organization for many years, and now professional for many more years. Scott now has a staff of over 80 employees, 80, in 28 states, working a great deal with farmers on agriculture and pollinators, working with pearly mussels and other mollusk issues, working on butterfly conservation and wetland insects and so much more. So I'm thrilled to share that with you and say that Scott, for a few years, was the chair of the Lepidopterist Specialist Group. I'm going back in time now, all the way back to the 70s again. And the World Congress of Entomology, which was held at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., 1976. Well, a little bit prior to that, Sir Peter Scott, who was the honorary president of British Butterflies at the time, and the chair of the Species Survival Commission of IUCN, he and I both thought there should be a Lepidopterist Specialist Group of IUCN. We founded that. I became the first director. We named our newsletter Apollo, and we had our first meeting at that conference in Washington, D.C. That was only the year after the monarch butterfly, at one time one of the most common butterflies in North America, certainly the most recognized and the most beloved for its size and beauty and its astonishing migration between Canada, the US, to the mountains of Mexico and the coast of California every winter to overwinter in the unbelievable mass winter clusters in the high mountains of central Mexico and on the foggy coast of California. This had just been found by Western science, including the Lepidopterist of Mexico City. They didn't know where it was either. The local people, the Indians, knew, of course, for centuries, but science did not. They were only detected there by Professor Urquhart and his colleagues in 1975. And so, and they were in grave danger from the beginning by fire and logging. And so at that meeting in 1976, we made the monarch the #1 priority in world butterfly conservation. A number of us went to work on that project. And it was only a few years from then that we put on the first Congress or conference on monarch butterfly biology and conservation. There have been several held since. And the first proceedings, the first one, were published in the Journal of the Xerces Society, Spanish in one direction to the middle of the book, English the other way. And again, Sally Hughes' wonderful drawing on the cover. But while this was being done, oops, what's going on? It's, oops, okay. Yes, pardon me. Got messed up with my control for a moment. Lincoln Brower, who was the great guru of monarchs for his entire career, died recently also. Founded the entire rest of his science career on the biology of the monarchs in Mexico. And the fact that they're still there at all today owes as much to Lincoln as it does to anyone else. Lincoln was the first graduate student of Professor Charles Remington of Yale, who founded the Lepidopterist Society in 1947. Both Remington and Brower studied with E.B. Ford at Oxford on Guggenheim Fellowships. But Lincoln and I became the chairs of the Monarch Project of the Xerces Society. Later on, I followed the monarchs in their migration for a book that became known as Chasing Monarchs. And I was able to discern that some of the Western monarchs go to Mexico too, which we'd never known before, which linked the Eastern and Western phenomena as we now know they are. And the monarchs of both California and Mexico have diminished by more than 90% over the years, but there's an enormous amount of expenditure and effort on their behalf now as they are proposed for listing, and the government does not want to list them because it will mean enormous changes in many ways. And so we're hoping that that will not have to happen. About the same time in the early 80s, Sir Peter Scott thought there should be an invertebrate red data book along with the other IUCN red books. I agreed with him on that, and we started the first invertebrate red data book. It was approved by IUCN at a meeting in Tsavo National Park in Kenya. I came back to Cambridge, and Jane Fenton and I set up the Species Conservation Monitoring Unit outside Cambridge until a proper manager could come along, and Jane and I could turn back to the red data book, and we got that going. And so for the next 3 years, the first invertebrate red data book was compiled there. I hired as my assistant at the time, later becoming the senior author on the project, Sue Wells, primarily working on the non-arthropods. And then the job being, after all, the biggest job in the world, we hired another very capable person on staff, and that was Mark Collins, whom I'm thrilled is with us tonight. And so Sue and Mark and I carried on and got this book done and got it out in 1983. And this, I like to think, inspired red books for butterflies and other invertebrates in many other places. It was a great big job, and it, what can I say? Mark went on, by the way, to co-author with Mike Morris, whom I mentioned already, a wonderful IUCN red book on swallowtails of the world, a splendid volume. And now, since then, Mark Collins has founded the Birdwing and Swallowtail Trust, of which he currently still directs, putting many of their efforts now into the keeping the swallowtail healthy in Norfolk, indeed, keeping it there at all. On Sally Hughes's wonderful illustration on the cover of the red book, you'll see the largest butterfly in the world, the Queen Alexandra's birdwing. Mark's group also works on the bird wings. And I had the great pleasure and exciting time in my life to go work with Sally Hughes in New Guinea for the government of Papua New Guinea, coming up with the Butterfly Conservation Plan, including their Butterfly Farming and Trading Agency, which brought the profits back into the villages and provided the incentive for protecting the habitats around the villages. So both social and conservation reform was the objective, and that program has led to many of the butterfly rearing programs around the world, except their livestock now goes to butterfly houses instead of the specimen trade that was primarily the case then. But we also were involved in coming up with the initial conservation plans for the giant birdwing butterflies endemic to Papua New Guinea, which were later followed up by years of study by Mike Parsons, and then Larry Orzak, and Mark Collins and his colleagues, and a number of other people. Still not safe, biggest butterfly in the world. Here's the male. In the Papuan coastal plains near Papandetta, where their rainforest has been decimated, more than decimated, by oil palm plantations, logging, volcanoes, what you will. And here, the biggest butterfly in the world, not photoshopped, the female, Queen Alexandra's birdwing. I did have the pleasure of watching this in flight over my head at Papandetta, which has to be one of the peak moments for anyone. By the way, this butterfly was first collected by Joseph Meeks with a shotgun. And if you can weasel your way into the collection, the type collections at the BM, Dick Wainwright and others might let you see the type specimen. which looks like this, except it's peppered with little buckshot holes in the wings that brought it down. I've seen it, true story. And we hope this butterfly and all the birdwings will persist. Good luck with the trust, Mark, and thanks for the good work. Thanks for being here tonight as well. Now I'm going to close on out with a final section that begins with another butterfly first collected with a shotgun. A little butterfly, a hair streak, hearkening back to Jeremy Thomas's black and brown hair streaks. This one is called Johnson's hair streak, and it occurs solely in Washington and Oregon and a little bit of California, primarily an extremely narrow forest band in the Pacific Northwest. It was collected by a man by the name of O.B. Johnson, Orson Bennett Johnson, the first zoologist at the University of Washington in Seattle, a contemporary of Meeks, certainly. I don't think they corresponded about hunting butterflies with shotguns, but Johnson founded the Young Naturalist Society in Seattle, which took out young and not so young naturalists into the parks and forests around Seattle with their nets, their high collars and their long dresses and their insect boxes to collect what insects they could in the environs of the young University of Washington. This is about 1912, I think, or actually even earlier than that, perhaps closer to 1900. But at that time, you could walk right off the University of Washington campus and into old growth forest, old growth hemlock and Douglas fir forest. And Johnson wondered what insects might inhabit the crowns of those forests. So he used a shotgun to bring down the boughs, the upper boughs from the canopy of those tall, tall trees, 100 and 200 and 300 feet in height. And on one of those specimens, one of his graduate students, C.V. Piper, later a major botanist in his own right, found this, sorry for the fuzziness of the picture, but you can see the highly cryptic nature of this caterpillar against its host plant, which is a mistletoe that lives only in the upper boughs of the old growth hemlocks. And that's how that butterfly was discovered, on a twig of mistletoe brought down by a shotgun and named for O.B. Johnson, not for the graduate student, of course. Nowadays, most of the forest has been forfeit to logging, and this kind of logging still goes on in the Pacific Northwest. The clear cuts are not quite as big, perhaps. Maybe a few more buffers are left, but it's still a land of logging where I live. And yet most of the remaining old growth in the Cascade Mountains has been protected thanks to President Clinton's forest plan that subsequent presidents have not managed to get rid of, and Biden has sustained. But to go see the larvae now in the field, we don't use shotguns. We get into a canopy crane that takes us 300 feet, actually 90 meters, into the crowns of the old growth forest, where we can search the mistletoe and find the larvae and bring them home to try to conduct the kinds of studies that Jeremy Thomas conducted on the black and brown hair streaks. So we're a little late, but we're trying to do that kind of biology here now, and we face some new and different problems. Of course, I have to address climate change briefly. What can you say? It's happening. And we worry for our wonderful alpine and Arctic butterflies, such as the Melissa Arctic here, brilliantly cryptic against the lichens on the very summit of one of the highest butterflies, of one of the highest mountains in Washington state, where I found it, the only place I've seen it. And that butterfly might be just plucked off the top of the high Cascade Mountains by global warming, because its larvae are indeed an Arctic species that cannot survive the heat and the encroaching vegetation from down below. We'll see. The first butterfly that was predicted to become extinct from global warming in the US is this one, the Uncompahgre fritillary, pictured here on a Forest Service biologist's nose before it was listed and became illegal to touch. She was monitoring it on its sole habitat, the high San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado. This is Uncompahgre Peak. I've been up to the 13,000-foot level about here, where the prostrate willow trees are the host plant for its caterpillars. And whether they are going to survive the warming of their habitat remains to be seen. I will keep you posted on that. The most endangered butterfly in North America is probably this, also the narrowest endemic. It's called the Hermes copper. It's too cute to be legal. It's the cutest butterfly of all time. It's a very beautiful little butterfly, but it occurs only in a 3 or 4 canyons in one mountain range east of San Diego. It doesn't even get down into Mexico. And its habitat is severely threatened by wildfire in the chaparral, where a lot of it's been lost. And this is a butterfly that could be extirpated at the species level, and there's no other species remotely like it, by one fire. Thank goodness California, which has been fire ravaged in recent years, has had more rain and snow this winter than for many, many years. And we hope it'll give the little Xerces and prevent another bad fire year, at least this year. Trying to get that butterfly established in more places. I'm going to come down toward the end here, farther north in California, at the Presidio. Golden Gate State Park, of course, you'll recognize Golden Gate in San Francisco. And this is the Presidio, the military reservation, whose construction leading up to World War II extirpated the final colony of the Xerces blue. And I'll simply bounce forward all the years since World War II and tell you that that habitat has all now been restored to the public, and the original habitat of the dunes has recently been recreated as much as we know how to do. So this is the Presidio of today, as along with a lot of uses for the arts and culture. There's a lot of restored habitat so that the butterflies extirpated from there are in fact being reintroduced. This one's already there, this checker spot. The ringlet will go back this year. And just a couple of weeks ago, on a plinth whose statue, who had been some egregious Civil War general or Indian killer, his statue was removed from the plinth, and the guerrilla conservationists, this is San Francisco after all, replaced it with an unauthorized statue of the Xerces blue. This is just weeks ago, and a plaque for it. And what I'm so happy to tell you is that the butterfly itself might come back too, because taking a leaf again from Jeremy Thomas's book and your book really, of putting back the large blue after its extinction, it occurred to me that why couldn't we do that for Xerces? Yes, it was an endemic. Yes, it was thought to be a species for a long time. Now the genomists are not sure that it might not be a subspecies of the silvery blue. So I wrote a piece called Resurrection Ecology, Bring Back the Xerces Blue. And I proposed reintroducing to the restored habitat at the Presidio the nearest known subspecies of the silvery blue. That has now been identified in a nearby county by the genomicists at the California Academy of Sciences, and this reintroduction is going to take place, inspired by the large blue in Great Britain. And we hope to be able to say someday that the Xerces blue is back to its old habitat in the Presidio. And we finally come to Bigfoot. Why Bigfoot? as well, we go from one extinct butterfly to an animal that perhaps never did occur. I wrote a book about Bigfoot, which has actually been my bestseller, besides my butterfly field guides and coloring books. And this book is about Bigfoot, yes, but it's about the culture of the Native Americans, the huge importance of Bigfoot in their culture for centuries all around the Northwest, and its importance to contemporary culture. It also is really a book about the conservation of an area called the Dark Divide, which is the biggest remaining unprotected wildland in Washington state. I went into the Dark Divide for a month backpacking to get to know the place. It's extremely rich in Bigfoot lore. I talked with many of the Native Americans who don't believe for a second that we are anything but idiots for not believing in the animal. Every one of them who still lives in the country considers the animal to be not a spirit being, but a member of the fauna. And they all have their stories and their sightings. There are now a few biologists and anthropologists who give credence to the possibility that it is an actual animal, but we won't go there. I was writing in the book primarily about the conservation of that wildland and the metaphor of the Bigfoot for all the remaining wildlands. The Dark Divide occurs between Mount St. Helens on the west, this in a picture before its 1980 eruption, showing the kind of logging that was removing all of those forests, and Mount Adams on the east. The Dark Divide is a wild ridge of stony rocks and ridge lines in between the two. And that is said to be the home of Bigfoot, the Dark Divide, by the Klickitat Indians. I backpacked in there and spent a month and had quite a time and came out and wrote the book. And to my surprise, the book was adapted for a Hollywood movie just a few years ago. And there's a reason we're doing this. You'll see in just a moment. The movie made a little bit of a splash, won some awards. It's a good movie. It has a wonderful cast and a brilliant soundtrack. The cinematography is absolutely stunning. But I was played by David Cross, whom some of you may know from his series and movies. He played Allen Ginsberg, the poet, in a Bob Dylan movie about Bob Dylan. Of course, he looks more like Allen Ginsberg than he does me. But he played me in a way that made me laugh a lot. It's not me, it's not the Bob Pyle you know and love that you're seeing in that movie, but it's all right. It's a fun one. And he had a lot of fun with the part. And my part involved teaching him netmanship for the movie. He kind of got it, kind of not. And my late wife, Tia, was played by the wonderful actress, Deborah Messing, who, by the way, whom you might know from her series like Will and Grace. So I don't think somehow that the British are quite as au fait with American television series as we are with yours. Lots of movies too, but she's a true sweetheart. So it was a lot of fun. And I got to be with Harvest Moon, one of the Native American actors in the movie. And here I want to mention that the movie came out in COVID and missed many of its theater playings, though it did make it into a number of cinemas and a lot of drive-ins, of which we still have 500 in the US. But this is one of the theater premieres, and I get to go along with Harvest Moon, a Quinault Indian who played in the movie. I want to say that the filmmaker, Tom Putnam, made a brilliant choice to de-emphasize Bigfoot in the movie, so it wouldn't be seen as just another silly Bigfoot movie, and to emphasize the butterfly research that I was also conducting in the Dark Divide at that time, which led to a review of a species, the description of 9 new taxa, one of which was named for my late wife, Tia, and another one for one of the Indian groups where this land occurs. And anyway, Tom knew that nobody would ever believe that I got a Guggenheim Fellowship to study Bigfoot, which I did. So he made it a Guggenheim to study butterflies, which was much better for the film in every way, I think. And here's my wrap up. This butterfly, the rarest butterfly in Washington, the rarest butterfly in the Dark Divide, the rarest butterfly is the golden hair streak. Wonderfully cryptic here on golden chinkapin, its only host plant. Here's the female, here's the male, and it occurs in Washington state solely in one little bunch of habitat around the base of the Dark Divide, right down here, called the Big Lava Bed. There's Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, Lew Witt, Pateau. This is the Dark Divide, the area where the book and the movie take place. This is where the golden hair streak occurs. And I spent 30 years trying to get the Forest Service engaged in its conservation. And since the movie, they're on board. So I like to think that we're going to save this butterfly, possibly partly because of our friend Bigfoot. Now I'm going to go down the Columbia River, across the Interstate 5 highway. Here's Portland, here's Seattle, here's where I live in Little Grays River, Washington, near the mouth of the Columbia River. In this valley.
Bob, we must wrap up very quickly
Yes.
now, please.
Here we are. That's where I live. This is the butterflies I live among. I have a native Apollo. I review articles and I work on the marble wings where we began our talk, and we finish with now the marble wing I'm working on now in the San Juan Islands of Washington. I worry the butterfly nets, the most important tool in insect conservation and entomology, will no longer be allowed in the hands of children, because the children, the little lepidopterists, become the big ones. And it is we who can do everything we can to save the butterflies, make a dent in the insect apocalypse, and if nothing else, provide the best possible toolbox for the next evolutionary iteration. Thank you so much, and pardon me for going over time. Such an honor to be here. And cheers.
Cheers, Bob. That was an absolutely wonderful, nostalgic trip back to the good old days of Monkswood and the incredible people that worked there. And it clearly demonstrated the incredible influence that they've had on butterfly conservation worldwide. Absolutely magnificent. Time flies when you're enjoying yourself, and I really didn't want to stop you. But you've almost done yourself out of time for questions. Can I just ask the Society if perhaps we can be allowed to continue until 9 o'clock latest? It's about 10 minutes.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went so long.
No, not at all. It was absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to invite Mark in a moment to ask his question. He was first with his hand up, as usual. But just before I do, I'd like to specifically invite any sort of early career or student entomologist here if they'd like to ask a question. If you could just put your hands down unless you are an early career or a student. And then if any in that category would like to ask a question, that would be great. It doesn't look to me as though there are any hands going up, in which case I will come to Mark.
You need to unmute, Mark.
There we are. I've lost your screen, but hopefully you can see me. You can hear me okay, I hope?
Yep.
Yeah, Bob, amazing talk. Thank you so much. And so lovely to see you again after so many years. That was really wonderful. And I thought a very warm and generous talk, with mentioning so many people and so many things that have been achieved over the many years of your fantastic and diverse career. It was truly inspiring to hear all about that. I'm sitting here in Norfolk now, just 2 or 3 miles from Strumpshaw Nature Reserve, which is one of the breeding habitats of the British swallowtail, of which we've got less than 24 sites left. And ironically, having been reduced to those sites by drying out and drainage of the fens and the Norfolk Broads, these sites are now being threatened by flooding, because of sea level rise and climate change, nearly all the swallowtail's breeding sites are at risk of the ingress of floodwater, and not just ordinary floodwater, but seawater, in fact, and salt water. And this afternoon, I've just been planning a conference here in Norfolk to look at ways that we can possibly think of to keep our freshwaters and prevent the place from becoming a salt marsh. Quite extraordinary the way it's all turned around. But I wanted to just ask you an impossible question. Do you remain an optimist yourself that we can somehow keep things moving for insect and butterfly conservation? Do you remain optimistic about it? And if so, why do you?
Thank you, Mark. So good to see you again, too. My old colleague, thanks for coming on board the Red Book and helping us get it done. Sue Wells and I were together recently. She came here for a conference, and we were laughing about how all the news coverage lately of how the monarch has finally made it into the IUCN Red Book. Did you see that?
Yes,
I'd say,
embarrassing.
come on, Mark and Sue and I put it in the Red Book 40 years ago. Okay, anyway. No, I'm not much of an optimist in the midterm. I'm a short-term optimist because that's the kind of person I am, and I can't help it. I've got my new microscope I just bought to look for tardigrades in my own moss. I'm optimistic I'll see tardigrades, and I'm optimistic in the long run. That is the very long run, because nature bats last. It's very, very difficult to sustain optimism in the midterm. Hope, yes, hope, of course. My source of it is going outdoors today and seeing the echo blues and the margin whites, which are our version of the green-veined white and the holly blue. But that's why I finished by saying what I did, that everything we can do now is, if nothing else, grist for the next evolutionary iteration, which might or might not include us, and might or might not include the things we're trying to save. But you know what? We're bloody well going to save them while we can, and we'll enjoy them. But we got to keep nets in the hands of kids. I worry very much that California has now banned the touching of monarch butterflies. And so all the tagging programs over the years, all the teaching in the schools, all of the traditional rearing of monarchs in the schools, illegal now in California. And there's a great fear that that kind of benighted thinking will spread, and that insect study will become not just limited to, the handheld device, which is rapidly becoming to advantage and not, but also we got to keep those nets out there. I have hope in children and butterfly nets. Thank you, Mark.
Amen to that, Bob. Jeremy, another one of your former Monkswood colleagues.
So glad to see you here, Jerry. Thanks so much for coming. And thanks for everything, as I said.
Well, hi, Bob. That was a wonderful talk, very inspiring, and personally, a trip down memory lane as well. Wonderful. Bob, the things that are going on at the States now that, you started all those years ago when there was absolutely nothing on insect conservation, and then it was butterflies, and then it was more insects, as it has been all over the world. At a practical level, what can we who have been doing it for slightly longer in the UK and Europe do to support your efforts and your successes in America? I mean, what can the Royal Entomological Society as a society do? We can certainly write letters, and support projects. Are there any tangible areas of help that you can envisage?
I would like to see more awareness all over the US, including those 80 staff members of the Xerces Society. They don't share the institutional history that you and I do, Jeremy, and and Mark does, and others here do, Richard does. More than anything else, come over and hold a staff retreat with the Xerces Society and inculcate them into the kind of work that's been done. More realistically, that would probably be done on Zoom. but I'd love to see actual physical face-to-face exchange between the historical figures, such as yourself and Mike Morris and others who survived from those days, but also the young people doing it now and all the people in between who are engaged in the, Monkswood and you and the others, it was sine qua non, without which nothing. All of insect conservation got to start out there in the fens, and it all came filtered through Monkswood, and it's all come down in butterfly conservation, the RES, and the Joint Committee and everything else. That needs to be known. And if I and Scott could help to put together some face-to-face contact, tutelage, sharing of journals, and sharing of personal experience, that would be the best that could be done as far as I'm concerned, short of actually going out in the field with you. And if we can arrange a few of those too, for some young scientists here to go to Britain the way I got to do, and to go out in the field with you all, both students, practicing institutional academic entomologists, preserve stewards, volunteer citizen scientists. Let's arrange some exchange of young people to pick up on some of these things that we had the honor and the privilege to get going. How's that?
That sounds brilliant. I mean, all those things are easily done. They all come down to money, and it's up to people like Ricky Harrington to take it up, perhaps with the Royal Entomological Society current council trustees and all the rest of it, and vice versa in the States. But the time and the effort of people on both sides of the continents, I'm sure, but certainly in the UK, we'd love to welcome a group of your guys, show them some of our conservation sites that are really humming now. Not just large blue sites. Large blue sites are great though, but there are all sorts of others as well with insects, not just butterflies, and of course all the other species that benefit from the conservation of insects, rare orchids, rare plants, and relatively common ones as well. So we'd love to do that. It can be arranged, and vice versa, if it can be arranged. There's a certain amount of money obviously involved in travel, and subsistence, but we might pursue this later. I'm speaking off piste here because I nowadays have no authority in the society, but there are people of influence listening.
Let's do that. Let's get them out to the blue sites and others with you, and to the swallowtail sites with Mark, and to the Duke of Burgundy sites with Richard, and everything else. Let's do it. We can find the money, and a lot can be done on Zoom, but let's do it. And let's lift a jar to that.
Jeremy, that was a great question, and that was a great answer, Bob. And Jeremy, please don't ever underestimate the influence that you have. we can make this happen. Let's try and pursue this and have something long lasting from this rather special evening meeting, which unfortunately I do need now to wrap up because it is 9 o'clock. Bob, I hope you've read the messages in the chat, which
I have not.
Phrases. You could skim through those quite quickly, but clearly those here have greatly enjoyed your talk. And can I suggest that to finish, we all unmute and give Bob a jolly good round of applause. Can you all unmute? Wonderful. Let's do it.
Thank you.
Well
Thank
done.
you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming, all of you. I can't tell you again, 43 years since I last spoke. Could not be a greater honor, and the Conservation Award as well. Nothing has meant more to me in my entire life. Thank you so much. And do raise a pint for me, even if it's not that pint of Elgins that I had last year.
Absolutely.
I'm still reading the chats. Thank you.
Right, I'll say goodbye.
Got it.
Take care.
Hey Bob, take care.
Cheers.
See you soon, I hope.
Thank you, Mark. Cheers all.